What's up guys, DK here with Collector's Impact, and today we're going to go over how to tell if a Pokemon card is genuine or not. So I did a recent video just like this for Magic cards to tell how they're genuine or not, and with the extreme popularity of Pokemon these days, I figured that I'd go ahead and cover this exact same topic for Pokemon. This video is going to mostly focus on the vintage cards, as that's where the majority of the money is, but I'll touch on the modern cards as well, just because there are, I think in terms of counterfeit cards, the market has more of an issue with modern cards versus the vintage ones, but there are some little subtleties out there that you definitely have to be aware of if you're going to be diving into this market, or if you're already dabbling in it and you want to go in further. But before we get started, if you wouldn't mind, please give the video a thumbs up if you like this type of content, and if you want to see more like this from Collector's Impact, definitely subscribe to the channel. Would love to see you on the subscriber list and be there to help you out with issues like this, as well as various other collectibles related topics and news. Anyway, back to the subject at hand, guys. So let's see. So when it comes to the vintage cards, let me start out of the gate with a few things that are very, that need to be said. I have dealt in this for quite a long time, so I have had actual customers many times ask these kind of questions. So I'm going to go ahead and preempt and cover these topics right away. The first thing is, in the United States and other countries other than Japan, Wizards of the Coast is the company that produced the Pokemon cards from 1999 to, I believe it was either 2002 or 2003, before they handed the mantle over to Nintendo entirely. Or rather, there was some stuff that went down and Nintendo got it back from Wizards, and the rest is history. But Wizards of the Coast was the producer of these cards from 1999 to that 2002-2003 time period. So with that said, the card game itself actually came out in Japan in 1996. It might have even been late 95, but I want to say it was 1996 for sure, was base set, and the others started hitting the market there. So one thing to note right out of the gate is that the cards that were produced in Japan were not made by Wizards. They were made by Nintendo, or another company that was, working with Nintendo. And the card game wasn't Pokemon, it was Pocket Monsters. So I'm sure that a lot of you guys know that. It's a pretty common trivia in regards to the Japanese game versus the American one. Pocket Monsters is what it was originally called in Japan. So the original Japanese cards are going to have this branding. It was later switched to something different. I don't even think that I have an example of that out here on the table to show you, but I'm sure that you've seen it if you've seen a modern Japanese card. But the thing to really note is the thickness on the Japanese cards from back in the day. These are thinner. They're thinner cards, and they're different material. And they're very, very reflective, and they're very glossy, like an old photograph would be almost. And their style of foil is different too. And we'll get into that a little more as we go on. And that's a key thing to note, is that if you get a Japanese vintage card versus a US vintage card, or another, vintage card from, say, Germany or France or Spain or whatever, they were printed by Wizards of the Coast. So their material and overall look and feel is very different. So it's important to know that right out of the gate, to know that you're not dealing with a fake card when you see stuff like this. That is a clear and easy way to tell that it's not necessarily fake, just for having those extreme differences. All right, now let's dive into the issues where you actually start running into problems. Right out of the gate, when it comes to something like first edition base set cards. So there is a semi-problem on the market, though it isn't that big, so that's good to note. Most of the stuff that you're going to encounter out there, especially from reputable sellers, I can't stress that enough, reputable sellers and reputable businesses, not someone who wants to meet you in the back alley at the Waffle House or whatever. That's not reputable, okay? You want to buy these from someone with good feedback on eBay or a storefront, or just someone who has a lot of experience and they have a record associated with that experience if you're going to be purchasing first edition base set cards. So that's first and foremost to really mention. But a problem that exists out there with these cards is that some of the cards that are out there advertised as first edition are actually shadowless cards. And what I mean by that is people take a shadowless card and then get a first edition stamp, right? And they get a first edition ink stamp and stamp the card with first edition. So the card itself is actually genuine, but it could have a fake first edition stamp. And that is a problem for many reasons, but one easy way to tell the difference between a fake first edition stamp and a real one is simply to get, let's just say that this Ekans, let's pretend this is a Charizard, for, first edition Charizard, shadowless, and you're concerned about the stamp. Unfortunately, really the only good way to test that, well, first off, shine it in the light and everything and see if it's part of the card itself or if it's raised or looks suspicious in any way, like it doesn't actually belong there. So that is first and foremost. But then other than that, you can actually use your fingernail or whatever other material you'd want to lightly scratch at it. And that, of course, could knock down some of the grading on it if you're trying to get it graded. If it's pristine mint, you might just want to send it to PSA anyway, you know what I mean? But if it's not pristine mint, then give it a try to go ahead and just scratch it a little bit. And if it doesn't come off, or if you can feel that there's no difference between the card and the stamp, then it's most likely genuine. If it starts to flake off in any way, shape, or form, then it's fake. Fake in terms of the stamp, at least, not the card itself. So that's one of those kind of weird situations, right? Because the card is genuine, so it's just that stamp that's fake. But there are actually fake cards themselves on the market. So one thing that I would highly recommend if you're going to be buying raw versions of either shadowless or first edition base set cards, since these are the most unique of all of the cards because of the way that they were printed without the shadow there. This was the very, very first printing. It's actually kind of one of these weird things where first edition and shadowless were produced at the same time, and the first edition ones have that first edition stamp on them from the factory, of course, and the shadowless ones don't, but for all intents and purposes they are the same cards. One is just branded slightly differently. And then after that, then they started printing them. This is a Team Rocket one, but we'll just pretend that it's base set, because this is what it would look like just without the symbol. Let's say Hitmonchan would look like that with the foil, and it would have this shadowed box. So one thing that I would recommend doing would be picking up a couple copies of some shadowless, cheaper foil cards. And that would be things that were available in the starter decks at that time, or just highly played cards. In the current market, they're really not too expensive, depending on how you view expensive. In terms of these old vintage cards, I personally believe that the shadowless raw cards are undervalued, because you could still get them for $20, $30, $40 a card, depending on what it is, which for that era of card and the fact that they're as rare as they are is pretty surprising. But that's a conversation for another day. But if you can get your hand on a few shadowless cards, it'll help you to be able to compare the real ones to any potential fakes that you may encounter out there. So that's first and foremost. Before you get into any sort of testing, having a couple example real cards on hand could save you a lot of headache and make your assessment of a card a lot better in terms of your confidence level and just overall ease of assessment. So with that, it's important to study all of the characteristics of the card, and that'll just save you time and everything in the future when you're looking at a potential fake, really, because they all look the same in terms of the general glossiness of the card, the thickness of the card. These cards are thicker than the Japanese cards. So that was the most common thing that I saw a lot of the time, was people, this one's played as heck, but a lot of people saying like, oh, this card is too thick. It feels so thick. It's got, but they're not used to it. It's important to note that, from 2003 onward, the card's thickness for even the US printed cards, the English printed cards, their thickness is the same thickness now as the Japanese cards were then. So that's a huge thing to note. is that you can't compare the new English cards to the old ones because these are thicker. They're noticeably thicker, and their overall luster, their overall everything about them is different. So having those examples on hand, like I mentioned earlier, is definitely a good way to tell. If you get a shadowless or a first edition card or whatever that is the same thickness and overall feel as a modern card or a Japanese card from this era, that's a clear sign that there's something wrong. These cards are definitely on the thicker side. Another thing to note, when it comes to the first 3 sets, I believe, so you have the base set, that includes the first edition, the shadowless, and the shadowed base set. I'll count that as one set. And then you had jungle and fossil. Those 3 sets all have this same type of foiling that Wizards of the Coast used on the cards. So when you look at it here, you can see that it's got like these star patterns. They look like something you'd see in like a Christmas card or something. You know, they have these very distinct 4-pointed stars with other little points on them and things like that are inside of the foil pattern. And the way that they are in there, it's kind of hard to tell on camera, but they have more of a 3D effect in the background, especially on a mint condition card. They really look great. Whereas the Japanese cards from the start, even in base set, in Japan, all had this type of foiling. So if you notice the difference, there's a lot of circles and little dots and things. There are some types of stars, but they're not that highly accented 4-point star like you see in the US version. So this does not exist in the Japanese original cards. That's a huge thing to note. It doesn't exist. It does in some later iterations of cards that were released way into the future, you know, i.e. like the Evolution set that was printed in like 2016 as a tribute to the original sets. They did put this foil pattern back into those cards, but that's a kind of a special one-off case. They don't exist in any Japanese cards that came out from the actual vintage era. So that's something to note too. If you're looking at Japanese cards and you see that pattern, there's something wrong with the Japanese card. That's a pretty big red flag. And vice versa with the English cards. If you're looking from base set, jungle, or fossil, and they have this foil pattern, that's a problem. But they did switch over to this foil pattern for the US cards starting in the Team Rocket set. So that's kind of fun to note too, right? So if you see this foil pattern in Team Rocket or onward, there's also a problem there. So this is very, very unique to the first 3 sets, and I can't stress that enough because that's pretty dang important and a huge red flag indicator if you're dealing with some shadiness or not. Next, let's bust out a loop really quick and see if we can see some detail in the actual cards themselves. The Magic the Gathering cards that were also, of course, produced by Wizards of the Coast in the exact same era and before Pokemon have a very distinct feature where they have these rosette-like patterns. They look like little roses, you know, patterns in the ink, but Pokemon doesn't actually have that. They have more of a traditional dot matrix dot pattern, so I'll show you that. So you see that on the camera. It might be kind of hard to tell, but we're looking at the background there, the what would be like the brown color. You can see the dot matrix style even printing with those black dots making up the pixelation of the background. That's pretty important. And just like in the Magic cards, the actual text is overlaid on the background imagery. So there shouldn't be any dots present in the actual text themselves. That would be another kind of a weird red flag too. The text should be solid black printed on top of the dot pattern background. So definitely, if you can, get yourself a loop. These things are super useful. You put them up to your eyeball and boom, and see the magnification on the card. So it's kind of hard to see on camera, but it's definitely a super useful tool when you want to inspect in great detail. If you see any sort of smudging or weird, uneven printing patterns on the card, that's a huge red flag that there's an issue because it was not produced using the same methods. Another thing to note on a genuine vintage Pokemon card is that underneath the top layer is a whole sheet of foil. So if you scratch the card, or if the card is scratched, foil should show through. And if it doesn't show through like that, then that's a problem too. If only the box area is foil and you can clearly tell that there's some sort of a difference in terms of the way that it's raised up or any sort of issue like that, or that foil is not present on the card, like you can even see it on the edges. If you don't see that kind of stuff on a supposed vintage card, then there's a problem, because it should be all the way through the card. One other thing to note with Wizards printed cards, even with the foil here, you can do a light test, very similar to how you do in Magic the Gathering, where you get a very, very high-powered LED light, and if you turn out the lights and put the light to the back of the card, which we will do right now, the light will shine through the card. Not as beautifully as it does on a Magic card, but because there's that thick layer of foil, but you can see the flashlight shine through the card. So if you can't see the light come through the card, and you do this test on a card that you're suspicious about and you can't see that light, then chances are there's some shadiness going on, which is usually them using too much glue or some other sort of non-transparent foil material in a fake card. The real cards, you can get that light to shine through. And all of those rules pretty much apply to all of the vintage cards. So, you know, the other thing I guess to note, which doesn't really have to do with counterfeit so much, well, actually it does. I'll note this too. So, if you have an English base set card and all of the attacks are in English, the name, you know, is different, but the actual attacks are in English. Flip a coin. If heads, the defending Pokemon is now paralyzed. If you can read that in English, and it has a first edition stamp, but it has the shadowed border, you know, like this, then it's 100% not a genuine first edition card, because they only ever printed the English ones in shadowless for the first edition. However, if it's in a foreign language, say it's in Spanish or French or German, and it has a first edition symbol, so long as the actual attacks and stuff are in German or whatever language, some of the languages did use the same name for the Pokemon. Some changed the name entirely. But those are genuine. And they're genuine. They're not as rare as the first edition English printing. They're about as rare as the 1999-2000 variant printing of the Unlimited set, which is, I don't know, roughly 2 or 3 times the print run of the original first edition set. Somewhere in that neighborhood. I'm sure somebody can correct me if I'm wrong there, but I think that it's about, I want to say it's 1/6 the total print run for all of base set, and then in comparison to the first edition and shadowless print run, the first edition foreign sets were about 3 times as many produced as those original first editions, which in comparison to all of the cards that exist for Unlimited, or for base set rather, it's still kind of rare. That's why even the first edition foreign Charizards and stuff can pack quite a punch in terms of price tag, because they're still pretty rare, but they don't hold a candle to the shadowless version. One other thing to note, which is graded cards. The reason that graded cards for Pokemon are so popular is because of that authenticity, because they're the easiest way right out of the gate to tell if a card is genuine or not. There are some circumstances where there could be a fake card in the slab, but if it's a genuine PSA slab, 99.99999% of the time, it's going to be a real card. So that's why people definitely give that premium in terms of collecting and the value that you can get from a graded Pokemon card, from having it in a PSA slab versus raw. It avoids all of the shenaniganry. Couple things to note about the slabs, if you're concerned if they're real or not, is the label itself has this unique ink here. I forget what they call it, but it's some sort of security ink that's kind of similar to, like in currency notes, how you can tell if it's a fake bill or not. They have some sort of unique ink there. Some of the words have special characters. It's ever so subtle, but if you look at the T in addition, it's not a standard T. It kind of has like a thicker top, and then it gets kind of thin. There's little things like that in the printing, and they're even more apparent in the newer graded cards. This one is slightly older in terms of its number of issuance, and then also the number of issuance. You can go on BSA's website and look up that number, see the card itself for how it was graded, when it was graded, the grade it received, and just make sure that the information matches what's on their record book for that label. And the case, real genuine PSA cases have a PSA branding here in the corner as well. And they also have a tamper-proof security measure where if you try to use a screwdriver or something to pry open the case, it will crack in such a way that it makes it extremely hard to reseal, plus it has some sort of like a color change effect. It'll turn blue or black or whatever, and it'll be very obvious that the case was tampered with. So there's all kinds of little extra security measures in these cases. And if the case itself is not genuine, like I said there with that branding as well as the labels and everything, it's pretty easy to tell, especially when you compare them side by side. You can tell if the case is shenaniganry or not. And lastly, I'll just touch really quick on the modern cards. There are so many different foil variations on modern cards and everything that it's kind of hard to tell the difference in terms of there's no general rule like there is for the old vintage ones where if it has this pattern then it's real, if it doesn't have that pattern then it's not real, kind of thing, because there's so many different patterns. So when it comes to the modern cards, you really got to use your best judgment and have a lot handy to compare. One of the key giveaways on a modern card is if it's super glossy, if it's like you could freaking pour water on it and it would just bead off, and you know what I mean? Like it's coated in oil almost. It's so glossy. That's a telltale sign that it is a fake card. This one here, you can tell, has some matte to it, so it's definitely genuine. Most of the new modern cards have a little bit of matte. I mean, they are glossy, but they're not that super gloss like it's coated in oil. That's a huge giveaway. Also, the foil patterns, they tend to be kind of diagonal like this on most modern cards, even on the full art style. They tend to run diagonally versus vertical, though there are some cases where they run vertical. So it's not an end-all be-all, but you can tell by the foil pattern with how it shimmers and shines diagonally versus straight up, and also just its general shimmer and shine. And its luster. Those are pretty key things. And thickness and everything. If the thickness doesn't match the cards in your collection, then there's a problem. And then lastly, the rarest of the rare cards typically in modern Pokemon are textured. So if you get a card that's supposed to be produced with texture and it's not like a lower rare variant or whatever, if you're paying for the top dollar, ultra rare or whatever this is called, if it doesn't have the texture on the foil, then there's a problem as well. So that's one of those extra security measures that they put in modern cards. You can see you can see it. It's almost like a fingerprint. It's textured all over the card. Well, guys, I think that pretty much wraps it up for how to tell if a Pokemon card is genuine or not. I hope that you found this video helpful, and if you did, again, please give it a thumbs up. I'd really appreciate it. And if you want to see more stuff like this in the future, please subscribe to the channel. Would love to see you coming back. So thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you next time. Take care.